Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Monica Monetary. You may also know me as Mo. I'm joined today by my producer, Dottie Vance, who will be helping me to monitor questions and answer questions as we go through the training. I also have a number of subject matter experts here with me to help provide any additional clarification and answers to any of your questions. So let's go ahead and get started. Today, we're going to go over the FERC Order 2222, which is going to introduce the new heterogeneous distributed energy resource aggregate, also known as HDERA, type to support the underlying distributed energy resources, DERs, and distributed curtailment resources, DCR. I know that's a lot to say, but I promise you it will be a lot easier as we go through the training. Before we get started, there's just a few housekeeping rules. I want to let you know that you will be muted upon entry to help minimize any background noise. And if you have any questions that you'd like to ask, please feel free to select the unmute button so that way you can ask your question, or you can put your questions in the chat. Lastly, you can use the hand raise WebEx option, which we will call on you to provide your questions. Also, one more thing to add, when we do go to the Q&A section, we are going to be able to, we do encourage you to use the thumbs up icon. So if we're able to answer your questions, please feel free to use the thumbs up icon to let us know that that did answer your question. And if not, then please feel free to provide any follow-up questions in the chat. Okay. So now our agenda for today, we will be going over the background for the FERC Order 222. We'll explain how it started and kind of where we are, and then we'll introduce the new master file HDERA resource, how that's going to impact you and what you need to know, in addition to reviewing the impacted applications and business processes that you'll also need to prepare for as you're getting ready to participate in the market for the HDERA resource. And then we'll also move on to the unstructured market sim scenario, so that way we can share the required information that you'll need to know in order to participate in market sim, and then we'll wrap up after that and provide you with some required or some references to help you successfully participate in the market. So why are you here today, and who does it impact? Well, it impacts participants who are, one, distributed resource developers, aggregators, and associated scheduling coordinator metered entities, the SCMEs. Now, these SCMEs are the people that submit the net meter of the load that represents the load being offset by behind the meter generation. And all these folks here are the folks that participate in the real-time and day-ahead markets. So we want to make sure we provide you, the customers who participate in these areas, to give you all the information that you need to be successful. So just to kind of go through the timeline, back in 2021, we the CAISO submitted a FERC filing for FERC 2222. And then we went back and forth, and then then the FERC filing was accepted in May of 2023, which brings us to this year. We were able to put together business requirements that we published back in July that essentially lets our customers know, what are some of the changes that are impacting them in terms of application, business process, documentation. So we were able to outline those, and some of the folks were able to provide some feedback through the BPM commenting tool, which is very useful. Just so you know, if you ever need to provide any feedback, definitely take advantage of that BPM commenting tool, because it's going to help us understand what some of your questions are and to be able to better prepare for the training that you'll be receiving. So I highly encourage that, and thank you to those that did provide comments through that platform. Also, that brings us to today, which is today's training, where we're going to help prepare you, explain what's changing, and then also walk through the market sim, so that way you can successfully participate. And then if you have questions, we want to make sure we have the right folks to answer your questions and share with you after the training as well, to get you to where you need to be. And then we're going to focus on the market sim. We're going to tell you about when it's happening, what's needed, and then what it's going to cover. And the market sim is essentially going to take place on September 16th until October 11th. So in the meantime, you'll need to register, but we'll go over all those details in the later slides. And then that leaves us with a go-live date of 11/1, November 1st. So pending market sim and testing, everything works out, then we'll be able to officially go live in production and implement this new change. So now let's talk about the background on this FERC 222 initiative. Now, as I mentioned before, we submitted a FERC filing back in 2021, essentially to remove the barriers for the distributed curtailment resource participation for our ISO market participants and the RTOs. Essentially, we want to expand the market so that way more, that allows more participation in other areas. And then later on, through that same initiative, since we were already let me step back. So we did have another initiative that supports the distributed energy resource, the DER market. And in addition to that, we want to open it up a little more so that way we can include DCR as well. So with that, we're able to modify the existing policy for the DER to incorporate the changes that we're doing in the FERC 222. And what that's going to do is it's going to reduce the maximum capacity requirement, which allows the HDERA, which allows the new DERA resource type with underlying curtailment resources, the HDERA resource. So essentially, we're modifying an existing policy to open the door so folks can participate with this new master file resource type. Now, with this FERC 222, the DERA participation model essentially allows us to be able to have participants who are already using the DERA. Well, these are already existing policies, should I say, existing practices. It's going to allow their resources to participate in the market as a market type, allow aggregators to register operational characteristics. Again, these are all existing. These are already ongoing. I'm not going to read through every single one of these, but the one that I do want to highlight is the fact that we're going to reduce the minimum aggregate capacity limit for the DERs from 500 kilowatts to 100 kilowatts for DERA. So this is something new that's going to allow more participants to be able to partake. So this is again, an existing DERA model, but the one that I do want to highlight is that we are changing the minimum aggregate capacity limit for DER, and that's going to open the doors for many folks. So now let's talk about this HDERA. You've been hearing about it, you've seen it through the market notice, but it's something new. It's not a new resource type, essentially, but it is a way for master file. It's a DERA resource, and it's one that will be established in master file. The H for heterogeneous is a way for master file to identify this as a specific resource type. So heterogeneous distributed energy resource aggregation, HDERA, is essentially a aggregate resource type that must have at least one underlying distributed curtailment resource. So that's the requirement right there. It has to have one underlying DCR. And the resource is not essentially a new resource type, but it is a way for master file to identify this resource type. And so you'll see in the GRDT and all other avenues where it mentions the HDERA, it's a way for us to identify it in master file so it can be defined in all the respective system. All the downstream system will know that this is a HDERA and it will treat it accordingly. Okay. Before I move forward, some of these terminologies are existing, but I do want to just call these out because you're going to hear me refer to them. So I do want to give you an option to have some refresher. So when you heard me mention DERA, D-E-R-A, it's essentially a resource that's comprised of one or more DER. What's a DER? Distributed energy resource. It's any resource that's located on the distribution system behind a customer meter in a UDC, a utility distribution company, or a metered subsystem, okay? And then you'll hear distributed curtailment resources, DCR. And that pretty much is a DER that provides a demand curtailment in a HDERA, heterogeneous distributed energy resource. So I wanted to make sure I call these out. I also have Dottie. Dottie has also added them to the chat, so that way if you're, going through this and you just want to get a refresher, it's there in the chat. But I wanted to make sure I give you guys a refresher on what these terms, what the definitions for these terms are. Now let's talk about an example of the new master file resource type, HDERA. So the DCR would have a similar, is similar to the demand response, which you may all be familiar with. If not, we do have an existing demand response type, a resource type in master file, but DCR essentially would be the same thing. It supplies the amount of demand curtailment below the baseline, while the DER injects the energy into the grid. Now, some examples of the HDERA resource may include a DCR or DER, for example, battery storage or rooftop solar, or a DCR with no DER. Some of the technologies from this resource type or DER and that's associated with DER or HDERA, are any technology that is able to inject energy into the grid. However, there are some technologies that may be restricted based on your LRA, your load regulatory authorities. They may not be able to participate, so you may want to look into that. However, we do not track those technologies that are not eligible, so that's something you may have to research, but we just wanted to let you know that these are examples of what HDERA resources can include, and then also the technology types that come along with it. I'm going to pause here for a moment to see if we have any questions. Dottie, go ahead, and can you let me know if there's any questions in the meantime?
Of course. So I do see one hand raised currently. Kathleen, I see that your hand is raised. You can come off mute and ask your question.
Thank you. Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. Can y'all hear me?
Yes. Yes, we can.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Mo and Dottie. Can you go back one slide? I'm just trying to kind of think through this compared to what we have today. So maybe an example just would, and if you're getting to this, that's fine. You can tell me to put it in the parking lot. But what I'm was curious about is the DCR in your example. So this distributed curtailment resource, if it has to be like conventional curtailment, what I mean by that is not associated with on-site generation. Or if it could also be like what I think of in the PDR space, we can come through and have PDR that's storage backed, so like a storage device, proxy demand resource. Is this an alternative, or is this saying kind of trying to separate the options? I guess what I'm most curious about is this just an additional option, or is it replacing some of the PDR, which you can be either like conventional curtailment or storage backed in that? That question, that makes sense.
No, that's a great question, Kathleen. Let me see if I have my sneeze here. Jill, would you be able to speak to this?
Sure. Yeah. Hi, Kathleen. Yes, that's a good question. It is not replacing PDR option. And we are assuming that those that are kind of participating under the PDR model will continue to participate under the PDR model. But the FERC order required the ISO, while we had our distributed energy resource aggregation policy already in place, it did incorporate load curtailment, but it was for curtailment of load directly metered. They requested within the FERC order, there is a requirement to also include demand curtailment and recognize that as a certain type of distributed energy resource that could also participate in a distributed energy resource aggregation. And the main difference is that these type of resources, a DCR, would be measured, not directly metered, but would be measured via a baseline methodology and could be comprised of aggregated demand below that DCR. So that was the whole part of FERC Order 2222, the main part, the most technology challenging for the ISO in terms of complying with the order. But it does not, we are not making any changes to PDR, which is our proxy demand resource, economic resource participation for demand response. Is that helpful?
Yes, very helpful. Thank you for clarifying. Appreciate it. Thanks, Jill.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Kathleen. Thanks, Jill. Dottie, any other questions?
Yes, I do see a couple other hands raised. You can please come off mute and ask your question.
Yeah, good morning. This is Chen Yu from PG&E. For the page 11, yes, the last bullet point, I'm just having a little hard time to understand. I think the last sentence, CAISO will not need to track this ineligibilities, like the technology type that it's ineligible. So in the approving process, if you're not going to track those, how will you know you're going to approve the master file or not?
Thank you, Chen Yu. Jill, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and answer that since I'm on. And Monica will lay out the requirement that is placed on the utilities when they're looking at these type of resources. There's a concurrence review that is required prior to it entering into the ISO's new resource implementation. And that is where this type of ineligibility is and should be tracked. So there is somewhat of a requirement from the distribution utilities to ensure that any type of DER associated with a DER aggregation is eligible to participate in that DER aggregation. So that is through the concurrence review process, which again, Monica will speak to. And again, this process has been in place since 2016 with the introduction of our distributed energy resource aggregation policy. The FERC order that we're complying with here does extend that to these new type of participating DERs, these distributed curtailment resources.
Right. Thank you, Jill. So there will be a place, right? There will be, not necessarily come to master file, but there will be a place that it's doing this check prior to, CAISO approving the resource.
Correct. Because these ineligibilities are really local regulatory authority ineligibilities, and there could be multiple. And so it's not something that we would be able to systematically track.
I see.
But there will be this pre-process that's required for all distributed energy resource aggregation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chen Yu. And yes, we will be going through all those requirements in the next few slides. So that way, you know that here are the instructions on what you need to be aware of, and we'll outline those as well. So, but thank you for that question. And Jill, thank you for the answer. Dottie, it looks like we have another person with their hand raised. Alva? Alva, go ahead and unmute.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Good morning, and thanks for this training. One question I had is, and I was confused at the beginning as to, so it doesn't sound like there's a new market model, but which resource market model is going to be used for these resources? We were able to register for simulation a resource that was putatively would include batteries and therefore had a negative P-min. So we were assuming it was going to use the NGR model. But I wanted to verify that with you and Jill. or is it using a different existing model?
Actually, we do have a slide that does cover those details in terms of what model master file will identify this new resource type as. I'll cover that in the next slide, or in the next few slides, but it is the generic fill source, which is for the NRM, the non-regulating energy management type, I believe. But we do have a slide that will cover that as well. I hope that will answer your question when we go into that section.
Yeah, I think you're answering that it's the NGR model. So thank you.
Mm-hmm. Dottie, any other questions so far?
So I currently do not see any other hands raised or any questions in the chat at this time. So I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you, Dottie. And again, great questions, everyone. We want to hear your questions. And if we're able to answer your question, definitely use the thumbs up icon on there, or if you have any follow-up questions, put them in the chat, because we do want to make sure we cover all of those. So go ahead, and let's go ahead and move on to the next one. Now let's talk about one of the applications that is going to be impacting the, that will be impacted with respect to the changes that we're making. Master file is one of those applications, and so we will cover the new fields that will be listed on the GRDT, the resource attribute submissions, how you're supposed to be submitting your information, the system validation and requirements, and how it's modeled. So Alva, this will help answer that question that you had earlier. Okay, so let's talk about the generator resource data template, the GRDT. If you have not already, on our release planning page, on our website, there is a link to the new, or to the draft, should I say, the draft GRDT version 18.1, which I have a link on the slide as well. And Dottie will put that in the chat momentarily. Thank you, Dottie. The spreadsheet is essentially going to have two new columns. The first one is going to list it as the distributed resource type, as you can see here. You'll need to indicate if it's an HDERA. For this column, if you select no, if you select, well, you're not going to select it on this sheet. Let me just step back. For the GRDT, the information that will be displayed on the GRDT will need to be, for these, this resource attribute, will need to go through the NRI process. And I do have another slide that talks about how you submit that. But essentially, you're going to submit this information, these two pieces of information, to the NRI process through the project details form, and it's going to be sent over to master file and will be displayed on the GRDT spreadsheet and the web service. So it will be listed as read-only. So when you go into master file, you're going to see your options that you've identified and have been approved for through the NRI process, and it will be listed, or I should say displayed on the GRDT as read-only. But it's essentially going to have two new columns that calls out what your selections are for the distributed resource type for the HDERA. You're going to identify, it's going to tell you if you selected, if it's listed as N, the resource type is a DERA, D-E-R resource, or distributed energy resource aggregation. If you see it listed as Y, then it'll be identified as an HDERA. And then if it's listed as null, then it's neither DERA or HDERA. But again, this will all be defined through the NRI process and will be displayed in master file. You'll only be able to see the selections on here, but you'll not be able to modify that information on the GRDT. But it is going to be, there are going to be two new columns that are visible to you on the GRDT. The next one, the second column that you see on there, is the baseline methodology for HDERA. This is important because this, again, is also something you'll be able to select and get approved for through the NRI process, and similar to the other column, resource attribute, it's going to be sent from the NRI from RIMS to master file so that it can be displayed in the GRDT. And whichever baseline you choose, there's only one baseline per resource, but whichever baseline you have chosen and have been approved for is going to be displayed in this GRDT. So that's essentially what you're going to see that's different on the GRDT new version, is what your selections are for the HDERA participation, the resource attribute that is. So that's what you're going to see under the resource tab. And this the document will be posted once we go live, but in the meantime, you can refer to this document, and it's listed again on the release planning page under FERC 222 and 2. And then Dottie's also added a link to this document in the chat if you want to take a look at that. And then also I have included the links to the PRR proposed revision, or the PRR there, PR 1586 for the market instrument BPM, in case you want to go in there and read a little bit more into that as to what's changing, how it's changing, and how it's going to impact you. So it is also available in there, along with the tariff section that is associated to this change. Thank you, Dottie, for including the link. The other thing is the web service, the XSD file for the master file. I believe it's the registered generator, generator RDT. That one's also going to have 2 new elements similar to what's on the GRDT for the 2 columns. That XSD file will have those 2 elements on there for you to download. The text specs were also uploaded, so feel free to refer to the text specs with those updated elements in the web service. And thank you, Dottie, for adding a link to that. Now, you're probably wondering, well, once this information's in master file for HDERA, what kind of information will flow into the respective downstream systems? So here's a list of some of the resource attributes. So it'll send over the scheduling coordinator ID, the SEID, the resource ID, HDERA flag to let them know if this is an HDERA participation, the baseline, the P node, the default generation distribution factors, and the sublab. So these resource attributes will flow into the respective downstream systems. So that way it will use that to apply to those systems accordingly. So as I mentioned earlier, master file will be receiving information for the DERA and HDERA resource attributes through the NRI process, through the project detail forms that you submit. So information for this master file resource type will come from the NRI team. So make sure that you do go through that team in order to ensure that your information is updated in master file. Also, if you need to make changes to the baseline, the GDF, DCR, DER locations, you make sure that you follow that same NRI process. It has to be vetted out through the NRI process so that way it can come through correctly. You won't be able to provide that information through the GRDT or any other platform outside of the NRI. I really want to emphasize that any changes that you make to this, please make sure you vet them through the NRI process. And we do have slides that cover those details. Now, if you accidentally submit that information through the GRDT, whether UI or API, it will be rejected. So just make sure you follow those NRI requirements. Alva, earlier you asked what will this resource be modeled as? So it will be modeled for the entity type. It will be generic GNRC. Sub-entity type will be NRM, non-regulation energy management. So this is essentially, it's going to be a generic NGR.
Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Alva. And great question, by the way.
Before you move off that, can I unmute and ask one more follow-up?
Absolutely.
Oh, great. Thank you. Sorry. Just while we're on it, can you go back to the last slide? I'll ask. Great question. I'm going to ask one more clarifying question. So can you just clarify for me, when I think about the dynamic demand response, so the DDR option, is that the same as GNRC, or is that a GNRC is a third option under NGR?
Jill, I'm going to have you or someone from master file.
Yeah, it is a third option. It's not that there is another option called dispatchable demand response, but this is a different option.
Different option. Okay, great. Thank you for clarifying.
Nope. As always, I appreciate you guys' question. Keep in mind that any of the questions you guys ask here, if we see, you know, an opportunity to update the slide, we'll add those clarifications there. So please keep them coming to help us make sure that this is this information is going to help you in the future going forward. Dottie, any other questions before I move forward?
I do not see any right now.
Thank you, Dottie. All right, so let's move on to the generation distribution factors. So master file defines the default GDF that's going to be applied to HDERA and DERA aggregates. The GDF will come from the new resource implementation side through the project details form. So that information will be sent over from RIMS or sent over from their NRI process over to master file in the back end, so that way it can be reflected in master file. Now remember, keep in mind, you cannot make changes to the GDFs through the GRDT or any other platform outside of going through the NRI new project details form. So it has to be updated through there to make sure it's consistent throughout all the other applications and will ultimately be, will remain in master file. Now, the question came up, are there any restrictions in terms of GDF? So one thing you have to take note is that you must have it can only have a single GDF, only a single GDF is allowed per P node and is used by default if the new resource level GDFs are not submitted with the hourly or daily market bids in Cyber. So if you don't submit a GDF in Cyber will use the default, and that default will come from master file. And that GDF, again, is established through the NRI process, through the project details form. So if you don't submit it, Cyber will default to what's in master file, ultimately. Now, one of the things I did mention earlier in the beginning that was changing as a result of FERC 2222 is that DERA and HDERA resources must have a PMAX or PMAX greater or equal to 100 kilowatts. And so previously you had to have 500 kilowatts. Now we've reduced it so that way you can participate and must have, again, the PMAX must be greater or equal to 100 kilowatts. So that's something new, and that we've updated our tariff to allow customers to participate. So one thing I do want to mention is that when you submit your information, you want to make sure that the PMAX is greater than or equal to 100 kilowatts, because it will be rejected. Master file will reject it if it does not meet those requirements. So I just want to make sure that you are aware of that. Now let's talk about how you're going to retrieve the DERA or HDERA attributes through the GRDT or web service or API, that is. Now, again, as I mentioned, I emphasize this because all the information with respect to this new master file resource type needs to go through the NRI process through the project details form. All goes there initially, and because it has to be approved. But once it goes through there and flows over to master file, how do you get that information? So what you can do is you can retrieve that information through the GRDT spreadsheet or the API, the web service. So you have two different options to retrieve the resource attributes. Your SCs will be able to go in and download this information. Again, you know, information goes through NRI, but any maintenance that happens after all of this has been approved, set up, gone over to master file, any maintenance after that, outside of what I covered before, baseline, GDF, and all the other attributes I mentioned previously, any maintenance after that should go through master file and not through the NRI project. So I do want to emphasize that the original information with respect to the baseline, the customer baseline, the GDF, and I believe there was one other item, those still need to go through the NRI process, but any other maintenance outside of that needs to go through the master file to make sure your information is current and accurate. So re-emphasizing what I mentioned earlier, master file is going to display what baseline methodology that you use for your HDERA resource. It will be displayed in the master file GRDT. And again, you have to make sure that this is approved. The baseline is approved by, or should say, through the NRI process. We have folks that do review your baseline methodology to make sure that it adheres to all the requirements. And then once it's approved, then they communicate over to master file to say, here's what they've selected. Go ahead and display the information so customers can retrieve that. And if you decide to go and submit that information through master file through the GRDT, it will be rejected because it's only, that information is read-only for you to see what you selected through the NRI process, but you need to make sure that you get it approved through the NRI process. I know you keep hearing me say NRI process. I really want to emphasize, go through NRI to get all your requirements approved before you can see it in master file ultimately. All right, I'm going to go ahead and pause here for a moment to see if we have any questions. Dottie, do we have any questions so far?
Thank you, Mo. So just as a reminder, if you do have a question, you can either use the raise hand icon and we'll call on you, or you can enter your questions in the chat at any time. So at this time, Mo, I do not see any questions in the chat, nor do I see any hands raised.
Thank you, Dottie. All right, let's move on to RIMS, Resource Interconnection Management System. This is the other application that's going to be impacted. Now, the items that we're going to cover in this section revolves around the initiation of the Distributed Energy Resource Provider Agreement, the DERPA, the project details form requirements, the baseline methodology approval, and the modification of existing data. Okay, this is really important here. Earlier, someone asked a question, and we said, oh, this was the one, Chun Yu, actually, you asked, you know, since we were not going to be keeping track of ineligible technology, and how are we ensuring that customers are submitting information that will be approved, essentially, right, through the ISO. This kind of flows into that. So when customers initiate the new DERPA, the Distributed Energy Resource Provider Agreement, our regulatory contracts team will provide, will have you submit a DERPA information request sheet, followed by a UDC MSS concurrence letter with the resource information listed in attachment A. This is really important right here. This letter right here will tell us more information about the resource that you're trying to participate in or participate with. So this is where we're reviewing, we're doing the checks and balance to make sure that information you provide is valid. So once you submit this information, our regulatory contracts team will review it, execute it, and make sure that it is approved. And then going back to that concurrence letter submission, here you see a screenshot of that concurrence letter. It's essentially going to request for information specific to the HDERA resource, or the resource, the DERA resource, should I say. And so here is a list of checklists that they look at, that they go through to make sure that the information that you provide in this document is accurate, and that if they have any questions, I'll follow up with you. But you have to make sure you follow these steps, and it will be reviewed by our regulatory contracts folks to make sure that what you submit is valid and is approved for the purpose of the agreement. So I believe Chun Yu, you had asked earlier, does this answer your question? Let me know, thumbs up. If not, please feel free to add to this.
Yes, thanks, Mo.
Thanks, Chun Yu. Okay, so now let's talk about the project detail form that I keep referring to. So this is really important right here. When you're submitting the request, or when you're submitting your information, you have to work directly through the new resource implementation team, the NRI team. And there is a project detail form that you have to fill out, and here are the requirements. Here's a screenshot of where you need to fill out, essentially identifying if this is a distributed resource type. So if it's a DERA or HDERA, you need to make sure you indicate that in where I've indicated selection 1. And then you also need to provide your baseline methodology, but you have to make sure that you submit all this information. So get that all sorted out prior to submitting the project details. You have to get approved for the baseline methodology that works for you. So once you do that, then you can input that information into the project details form. Then you provide your sublab information, and then for the distribution, you'll have to identify it's predefined or customized, and if it is customized, if it's a customized location, make sure you provide the P node and the GDF. Okay. One thing I do want to mention that the total sum of the GDF must also equal 1. So you can aggregate your GDF, but ultimately it has to equal 1. In addition to the project details form requirement, RIMS will validate for each DCR and HDERA if the resource has a minimum nameplate megawatt greater than or equal to 0.1 megawatts. Now, if it does not meet those requirements, the system will throw an error message, and it will not be saved in the system until you submit the value that meets the requirement. So it'll either be canceled or rejected. Also, you need to make sure that you populate all the required fields in RIMS in order to save your changes. If you don't, then again, the system will reject your request, and you'll receive a notification letting you know that it did not get approved or it was rejected. So essentially, make sure that your nameplate is, again, greater than or equal to 0.1 megawatts. Make sure you fill out all the respective fields so that it doesn't get rejected. And if it does, you'll get a notification saying that your submission was rejected. Going back to the baseline that we talked about earlier, in order for you to select a baseline, it must be approved by the ISO. We have a team that actually reviews all the documents that you submit along with it. Your forms all need to go through the NRI process, so that way they can work with their respective people to make sure that everything in the documentation is valid, meets our requirements, and once it's approved, they will communicate with you, and then after that you can move forward with submitting your project details form. So make sure that it is approved prior to you submitting your project details form with all those details. Okay, so now let's talk about the requirements for modifying the HDERA resource information. Now, if you have any, if you need to modify information that you've submitted before that revolves around a new or removed underlying location, modified maximum capacity amount, new baseline, or changes to the resource scheduling coordinator, you have to go through the NRI process again. This is really important, I must emphasize. Anything that you change must also be initiated by a concurrence letter. So that template, the form that I shared earlier that our regulatory contracts team covers and processes, you need to make sure you submit all these new changes, and they have to be updated through the concurrence letter, in addition to resubmitting all your information back through the NRI process, okay? And then if anything is no longer valid, that also needs to be updated. We want to make sure the information we have on file through your agreement and NRI is correct and up to date. So please make sure that you submit all your information through the NRI, in addition to updating your concurrence letter, anything related to HDERA resources. It applies the same with others, but this one for HDERA, you also have to make sure you keep your information up to date. It is your responsibility to ensure that the information we have is current and accurate. Dottie, I'm going to pause here to see if we have any questions with respect to information we covered for RIMS.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Mo. So I'm looking right now. I currently do not see any questions in chat, nor do I see any hands raised at this time.
Okay, thank you. And Dottie, you're doing a great job. Thank you for posting the links to the items that I'm covering, so thank you for doing that. Now let's talk about cyber, scheduling interface business rules. Now here we're going to cover the master file attributes, the net benefit test, the GDF submissions. So similar to the demand response, Cyber is going to apply the net benefit test to all the HDERA resource bid submissions, and it's going to use the same price thresholds as the PDRs. This was something that was a huge huge topic during the FERC filing review. So we wanted to make sure that you understand that Cyber will apply the same net benefit test to all HDERA bid submissions, and they must adhere to the same price thresholds for the PDRs. Another thing I want to mention is that Cyber rules will only accept bids that are above the net benefit test for these resources. Now, on the left, you see a screenshot of the demand response net benefits test results, which is available on our website. We do have a link down there. Dottie will be adding a link to that page so that way you can see a list of all the different net benefit tests for each month. I believe these are posted a month before, mid-month or so, for the following month. So if the month is October, they will be posted by September. Please make sure that you review the threshold price before you submit your bids for Cyber for this resource type. And if you submit bids that do not meet the requirements, then your bids will be rejected in Cyber. So make sure, whatever you do, make sure you refer to this document to make sure that your bid submission is above the price threshold as detailed on the net benefits test results report. So now let's talk about the GDF submissions for its associated scheduling coordinator. Cyber, this UI, Cyber UI, and the API will accept the HDERA and DERA resource GDF for the hourly and daily bid submission from its associated scheduling coordinator. It can be only one set of GDF may be submitted for a given hour. No GDFs, if there's no GDFs that are submitted, as I mentioned before, it will default to the GDF that's in master file that was provided through the NRI project details form. So if you don't submit a GDF, it will default to master file who has the information that came from the NRI process. Now for the master file GDF, it's used by default. In master file. If the SC assigns a new GDF with the hourly bid submission, keep in mind, if you submit a new GDF through Cyber, that is only temporary. After that, it will default back to whatever whatever master file has on file for your GDF. For instance, if there's an outage and you have to something changes, you have to submit a different GDF. You'll need to submit that through Cyber, but after that, it will go back to what it was as a default in master file. So here are some examples of some modifications. For instance, the removal or addition of underlying DER, DCR changes to HDERA or DER, DCR capacities, changes in ownership or SC, and then of course modified baseline methodology. So here's some, here are some examples of some modifications. So, and let's go ahead and go to the next one. I think that's essentially it for the Cyber impact. So, Dottie, I'm going to go ahead and pause again to see if we have any questions related to any Cyber changes.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Mo. So again, just as a quick reminder, if you do have any questions, you can use the raised hand icon feature in WebEx. We'll call on you to unmute and you can ask your question verbally, or you can enter a question at any time in the chat and we'll get to you that way. I'm looking now, Mo, and currently I don't see any questions in the chat, nor do I see any hands raised at this time.
Thank you, Dottie. And again, if you have some questions later after the call, you're more than welcome to send questions to us at customerreadiness@CAISO.com. And we will be sure to share those questions with everyone so that way, in case you didn't, it wasn't a question you were thinking of and you someone else thought of a question, we always want to share questions with our customers so that way you guys all have the same information. All right, so let's go ahead and move on to the next. We're almost done. So let's go ahead and move on to MRS, the Market Results Interface for settlements. Now here, we're going to talk about the metering measurement data submission for HDERA and DCRs, and then we're going to go over some sample equations. We're going to talk about the sample equations on how HDERA combined baselines are calculated, and then we're going to talk about the metering and monitoring measurement data, how it should look like. And again, I just do want to call out that, again, on the BRS commenting tool, we did get some great questions, so we will share those with you guys also afterwards. But questions that came in through the commenting tool really helped us identify what areas you have some questions on and needed some clarification. So I want to acknowledge that, so thank you. So now let's talk about the metering measurement data submission for HDERA and DCR resources. Now here on the metering side, under the meter data tab, we want to make sure that when you submit your meter data that your measurement type, your MSMT_type, is reflected as gen for generation. So meter data should always be gen for generation. And also I do want to call out that there's no changes to the way that you submit your files, whether you do it through the CSV or whether you do it through your meter submission application. Just make sure that you select gen for your measurement type. But in terms of how you upload the data, all the same, no changes. Next one is the demand response monitoring data. So there is another sub-tab under the meter data tab where you would see this information. You would upload it through the, I believe it's the batch status tab, sub-tab, but either way, you go in there, you submit your information. Just make sure that when you submit those details, you identify for your measurement type, if it's a base, if it's a CBL base for baseline, if it's a gen for generation, if it's a load, make sure you identify those correctly for your monitoring data. So I just wanted to call that out. And we do have some training for from the energy storage for the HDERA that we had a while ago, and so we'll see if we can provide you with a link to that later on, so that way you can see, you know, what information was covered in a previous training and how it would impact this. So to kind of give you some more background, and if you have any questions, definitely let us know after that, but we'll provide you a link to that later on. Perfect, thanks, Colleen. All right. So now let's talk about the demand response monitoring data. Now, some of the information that the scheduling metered entities submit for the HDERA with respect to monitoring data includes, and this is all submitted in MRS, it includes demand curtailments that are provided by the DCRs, the customer load baseline, the CBLs that are used to calculate the demand curtailment for the DCR, and also the actual underlying consumption energy during the hourly intervals for calendar days for the meter data that's collected to develop the baseline. So all this information is provided by the scheduling coordinator metered entities into MRS for us to monitor. We also talked about the equations that come along with this, right? The sample equations on how HDERA will combine its baselines, how those calculations are performed. Since there's many different there's several different calculations that are listed in there with that are associated to the baseline. We're not able to include it on the slide. However, we have a link to the demand response BPM that will allow you to refer to section 5. It goes through the different baseline and shows you what those calculations are. In addition to that, we've updated some information on the tariff with or I should say, there's information on the tariff referencing these performance evaluation methodologies. So when you get a chance, feel free to go through the demand response BPM, check out section 5. It will detail all the calculations that are associated to the HDERA baselines. So take a look at that. All right, I'm going to pause here and see if you guys have any questions. Dottie, do you have any questions so far with respect to MRIS?
Mo, thank you so much. So again, I'm looking in the chat. I just posted a link to the BPMs that you were talking about. I don't see any questions there, nor do I see any hands raised at this time.
Thank you, Dottie. And again, feel free to ask any questions. We are coming to an end soon, but I do want to make sure that we answer your question. We do have folks in the room that can help clarify. And if you have questions later on, remember you can always email us at customerreadiness@CAISO.com.
Oh, Mo, before we go on, I did just see a hand go up from Kathleen. So we can take that question real quick before we go to settlements. Kathleen, if you want to come off mute, please.
Great, thanks. I think I was trying to take the cue for you're kind of getting close to wrapping up. But I had one question that you hadn't resolved yet, and so I was saving it for the end. It's really about the NRI comment that you have been emphasizing the whole training. Do you want me to hold that for the end to let you finish, or is this okay to ask it? Okay.
Go for it.
I really appreciate you emphasizing that. This might be a silly question, but for me, an NRI is a process just for new resources, but you were talking about using it for modifications of the GRDT, and I wasn't quite understanding what that means. Like, does that mean you have to literally terminate the existing resource, go back and create a new NRI project?
No, that's a great question, actually, and I believe we have folks from the NRI team as well. Andrew or Chandra, do you want to elaborate on that? Well, essentially, so let me see if I can give it a try, and then we'll see if we can't get a clarification now, we can at least provide you with that afterwards. But I want to see if I can try. So essentially, for the HDERA resource, master file resource type, specific to this one, normally, yes, you're right. Everything normally, for new resource types, it would go through NRI for new resource types, so that way it can flow into the respective application. Normally, that's the case. However, it's a little different with this one for the HDERA master file resource type, because there's information that needs to be vetted through the NRI team, specific to the customer baseline, and then it also revolves the concurrence letter, right? The documentation that the regulatory contract folks need to be aware of. So for the purpose of this HDERA resource, we need to make sure we have our checks and balance, so that way we can utilize the existing NRI process to filter, review, process information, and send them to master file. Because as I mentioned before, master file, it's not going to allow you to submit these resource attributes through the GRDT. So it's a little different for this specific resource type, where you have to go through the NRI process so that they can flow that flow that information into master file. What you said earlier about new resource is accurate. This one's a little different because it's a little special, where we have to make sure we have the right people reviewing this change for the baseline, and then all the information that needs to go into the agreement for the concurrence letter. We need to make sure those are up to date. So we need to have a special process to validate that information, and we're leveraging the existing NRI process for that piece. Does that help?
Yeah, no, I think it does help. And maybe as a follow-up, if I can just ask you to circle up and think about adding this level, what I'm wondering is if, since it's sort of different process, is if it's not, like, does the NRI project, let's say, create this project, it goes into operations, and then you want to modify something, does that mean that it's still active in NRI, we're just going to keep it active and then have updates? Or does it mean that it's completed project when it achieves commercial operations, but that we would send an email to the NRI team? Just practically trying to think through the logistics of it. Thank you.
No, that's a great question. I think I see a hand raised by Michael Schultz. So Mike, do you want to go ahead and elaborate? But that's a great question. Thank you for that clarification, by the way.
Yes. Hi, everyone. Michael Schultz. I'm the business analyst for the FERC 2222 project with the California ISO. Kathleen, great question. I think this kind of also builds on what Tunyu was asking, which is, kind of how we do tracking versus, I think what we're saying is assessment of technology. So each time we make changes to the underlying DCR or DER resources or ownership, like Monica was saying, we need to reassess what the for each time we make the change to make sure everything's accurate and how we're modeling it. I don't believe it goes through a full restart of starting everything from scratch, but we do need that concurrence letter to start off. So I think what it is just saying, unfortunately, even when you have an established resource, whether it's DCR or HDERA, you would need to go through and submit a new concurrence letter just so that we can start the process to reevaluate whether you change the baseline methodology, any types of changes. It wouldn't be a complete restart once you have a resource established in master file, but my understanding is you do have to kind of go through this step of process. It'll be a little streamlined, but I really appreciate that clarification, Kathleen. And one of the things we talk about tracking is we're not going to be recording like technology in the master file types. We're going to assess it, but we're not going to track it. And so I think that distinction also just wanted to clarify. But thank you.
Great clarification. And Kathleen, love your questions. Keep them coming. We'll add some clarification to the existing presentation. We'll post a new revision with all the clarification and questions you guys provided today. So thank you for all of that, guys. Any other questions so far, Dottie? Just want to give an opportunity, maybe even to our SMEs, to see if they want to add anything else.
For questions, I do not see at this time any questions in the chat or any hands raised. And like you said, we are capturing these questions and this feedback, and we will get this slide updated after today's training. So I'll pass it back to you, Mo.
Thanks, Dottie. All right, let's go ahead and move on to settlements. So for settlements, we are going to be covering the generic NGR NRM resource, the way it's modeled, and then we're also going to talk about the HDERA composition example. So for settlements for HDERA, I do want to emphasize that for HDERA settlement, it is going to be determined as an aggregate sum of the net energy that's provided by the DER, and it's going to be accounted for the load and any negative energy, and then and also for DCR. So essentially, this, like I said, this is going to be determined as the aggregate sum of the net energy provided by DERs and DCRs. So in settlements, you're not going to see any new charge codes. The way that's going to be reflected in the statements is going to be reflected as a generic NGR NRM resource. So those are the changes that are happening with settlements. The attributes from master file, as I mentioned, are going to flow into settlements and identify that this is a HDERA resource, and it will be displayed as a generic NGR NRM resource. Again, no new charge code, it's just the way that it is presented in settlements. Any questions so far?
No, so I'm looking to see it, and currently I don't see any questions at this time.
Okay. I did mention the composition of the HDERA calculation. We do have that in our reference section, and we do have some clarification to explain those calculations as well. So I will share that, but it'll be in the next few slides. Before we do that, let's go ahead and move on to the market sim unstructured guided scenario. Now, as I mentioned earlier, for Market Sim, it is going to start on September 16th and will end on October 11th. The Market Sim scenarios are posted on our release planning page. The document is available there. It will essentially require our participants, you guys, for the WM market participants, you will perform the following tasks as detailed on here. You'll submit your HDERA you'll register and then you'll submit your HDERA resources for the master file folks. You'll verify that your resource is available for or I should say, verify resource availability in the cyber net benefits test. And then you'll verify in MRS and also in RIMS and then settlements. Same thing with ISO mark participants. You'll do the same thing. And then once you're able to verify your HDERA resource in those respective systems, you should be able to complete your market sim requirements. So if you have any questions also as you're coming across any issues, please make sure you submit those via city ticket. I know that there are some customers that have tried to participate, that have registered to participate, and there are some questions that are coming through, so make sure you submit the city tickets so that we can have the right folks review your questions in the meantime. As I mentioned earlier, we want to make sure you have an opportunity to register for the market sim with respect to this project. Registration opened yesterday on September 11th. Make sure you email the marketsim@CAISO.com mailbox to register your resource. And then we also have market sim user groups that are held on Mondays and Thursdays. The information on the meeting logistics are available on our calendar. I recommend you guys attend these calls because you may hear about issues that other customers are experiencing, and so that way, if you run into the same issues, you'll be able to know how to resolve those or use alternative methods. So I recommend you guys participate in the market sim forums. Lastly, as I also mentioned earlier, please submit a city ticket with any questions that you have. If you run into issues, let us know, because before we go live, we want to make sure we vet out through any issues that you're finding in the system with respect to this initiative. I'm going to pause here real quick for any market sim related questions. Dottie, do we have any questions?
Thank you, Mo. So I'm looking to see if there's any hands raised. I do see a question in the chat. It says, does the MP submit meter data, or will CAISO be handling the metering?
Gita, thank you for that question. I'm going to go ahead and see if Priyanka can provide an update for that or elaborate on that. Someone from our metering team, and if we don't have a response, we can get back to you. We can find out. And Mike Schultz, go ahead and unmute.
Hi, good question. The metering would be submitted by the SCME. So that is one of the obligations of the SCME, is to submit the metering into MRIS. We also have an additional, because of if you have underlying curtailment DCR type, you would also have monitoring submissions as well, and that kind of goes into the other types like CBL and load submission types for measurement. The great reference to access, and just kind of refresh yourself on what those measurement types are, would be to look at Appendix B of the demand response BPM. That kind of goes through each of the types and kind of what they're about. But any other questions, definitely follow up with our team. Did I answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike, for the clarification. Dottie, do we have any other questions? I do see a question from Andrew. This training is recorded and will be posted in the next 3 business days. So yes, it will be available for you to review after that. Dottie, if you want to go ahead and read out that question from Alan Wong.
Oh, yes. So from Alan, I see, apologies if this was covered, but how will underlying HDERA customers' locations be verified that they are not registered in more than one resource? For example, for PDR and RDRR, the Demand Response Registration System, DRRS, handles the creating and registering of locations.
I'm going to go ahead and see if we have our subject matter experts in the room. Priyanka or anyone from your team, or Mike?
Yeah, Monica, I can address that.
Yes, Joe.
Again, it references back to the process, and this process was put in place with the DER aggregation policy in allowing DER aggregations to access the markets. And it is, again, part of the concurrence review process. So there has been adjustment to the template of the concurrence review template that is required to be submitted to the IOUs, to the distribution companies in which these DCRs, in which the DERs are located. And that is the review process that somewhat parallels the review process that we have for within the demand response system. Again, it's not utilizing that system, it's utilizing a process. And that process will identify locations within the distributed curtailment resource. And those have to be reviewed and determined whether they're eligible by those reviewing entities. And that concurrence review is required before, again, this resource enters into the new resource implementation process.
Thank you, Jill. Ellen, does that answer your question?
I think I understand what Jill is saying. I'll have to check internally to see, how that may play out from a dispute process if the customer resides in a, different registration or whatnot. But I think I understand. It's more of the process than the system for this particular policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. And thank you, Jill. Dottie, do we have any other questions?
So at this time, I'm looking in the chat and I'm looking for hands raised, and I do not see any.
Thank you, Dottie. All right, we're getting pretty close, so let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. So now we're going to go ahead and wrap up and talk about, let's see if we can recap what we've discussed so far. So again, one of the important things we mentioned was that this effort is going to reduce the DCR and HDERA minimum participation capacity to 100 kilowatts from 500 kilowatts. We also introduced the HDERA resource type in master files. Those are the aggregates with underlying DCRs. We talked about the new fields elements in the GDR spreadsheet and web service for customers to retrieve. Again, reminder, you can retrieve the information with specific to the HDERA and the baseline, but information still needs to flow through NRI to be approved first before it comes through master file. We also talked about the consumption of HDERA resources in multiple applications. We went through cyber, MRIS, master file, and one other application, but we wanted to make sure you understand the impact that these other applications have. And then we also emphasized the NRI business process requirements for the project details because it ties into the concurrence letter that needs to be provided, updated, and there were some really great questions that we'll need to go back and provide updates to the slide to emphasize the clarification with respect to why we're doing that. The other piece was regarding the net benefits testing in cyber and how it's going to be similar to the way that it's being performed for the PDRs, so it will be applied to cyber. For settlements, again, it's those attributes are going to flow into settlements, and it will be identified as an HDERA resource. Again, no charge codes, no new charge code, no changes, except for the fact that it will flow into settlements as well. And then lastly, we want to make sure you get a chance to participate in the unstructured market sim, which starts on the 16th. Registration window is open, so make sure you guys sign up because we want to make sure you help test these functionalities. We want to roll things out that are resolved prior to the go live date. I thought I saw a hand raised from Chunyu. Chunyu, did you have a question?
Hi, Mo. You're saying the market sim starts on September 16 here. I just want to confirm that because I heard that maybe I am wrong, that it's going to start on September 30th.
Oh, we do have Trang here. So Trang, could you help provide some update if something has changed?
Hi, Chunyu. Thanks for the question. The market simulation window, it includes a 2-week connectivity period. So the September 16th start date kicks off the 2-week connectivity period where the ISO will conduct our end-to-end in the map stage environment with all of the new functionality. And then the unstructured market sim execution for customers will begin on September 30th. So that's the distinction within that overall window.
I see. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Chunyu. Thank you, Trang. And we'll add some additional clarification to the training so that way you'll have that in there as well. Dottie, are there any other questions before I move forward?
I do not see any at this time, Mo.
Thank you. Okay. All right. So as I mentioned previously, we are going to post the training. We're going to update the training presentation with all the amazing questions you guys have asked. We're going to add those clarification, and then the recordings will be posted within 1 to 3 business days on our training center. So I just wanted to let you know that here, if you want to go through there, it's the on our CAISO site. It's the Stakeholder Center tab. Go to the Training Center, and then once in the Training Center, you go to the Training Topics, Release Initiatives, and Readiness Notes, and that's where you'll find the presentation along with the recording once we post all those details. All right, as I mentioned earlier, we have some helpful references for you. So just some terminology, some glossaries, so that way, in case you want to just have that for reference. And these are available on our training slide, list of all the impacted business manuals and the changes, along with the tariffs, a list of the valid customer-based methodologies for your convenience, so you'll know which ones to look for. And again, these are also available on the demand response user guide, along with more details. And in addition to what we cover, all the links that we've covered here are also going to be available for you to access if you ever need to get back to them. And if you have any questions that you'd like to submit, you have the option of submitting a city ticket. You make sure you submit the market sim functional environment, so that way they can all flow into the appropriate teams to make sure we get your answers delivered to you. The HDERA composition that I spoke about earlier, here's a diagram that we've included. It's also included on the BRS, external BRS in the appendix, but we also included some clarification with some calculations that will help you understand how those are performed. So this is also available in the reference guide. And then one thing I do want to call out is that we do have the Stakeholder Symposium for this year that is scheduled to take place on the 29th. Just as a reminder, the 29th, the 30th, and it's not too late to register. I believe we are at 500 so far. So please take an opportunity to see if you're interested in attending. I just wanted to remind folks that it is still available for you to register for. And before we end, I do want to I'll let you know that if there's anything else that we can do to help improve our training presentation, please help us by providing feedback through our survey. Let us know what we can do. If there's something you like or something you'd like to see more of, let us know, because it is going to help us improve our training in the future. And that wraps it up for the day. Again, if you have questions that you thought about after this, I want to hear them. Send them to customerreadiness@CAISO.com. And once you do that, we'll make sure we include them in the presentation, so that way if you ever have to look back, you'll have those answers available to you through the training presentation. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dottie. Thank you to my subject matter experts who participating today. And also thank you for just your patience on allowing us to share this information with you to help you with a successful participation once you are getting ready for the deployment of this new change. So thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks, Mo.